Hello, everyone. My name is Mo Hamid, current chair of the Institute for Public Relations Measurement Commission. This is the Measure Up video series, where we talk about the future of public relations and strategic communications as a profession and the exciting things that are ahead. Today, I'm very glad and very happy to be joined by Rob Yekielek from the Harris Poll. Rob is one of the newest members of the Institute for Public Relations Measurement Commission, and he's had a really interesting background at some of the world's most renowned communications research companies, as well as agencies. Rob, welcome.
Hi, Mo. Great to be here. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. We're excited to talk to you, and we know that the Harris Poll has been doing a wide range of research relevant to what's happening in the world these days. So we're very excited to share that with our audience today. Rob, you've had a really interesting journey from your start at companies like KPMG and of course the Reputation Institute, which I think is now called RepTrak.
The RepTrak company, indeed.
Yeah, and of course you know many agencies like W2O, and now you're at the Harris Poll. But tell us a little bit about how this journey in communications research really unfolded for you, and what some of the highlights have been over the years.
Sure. So we're going back more than a couple decades as we go to KPMG. I worked at KPMG in the management consulting practice, which was actually interesting because it at the time got spun out from KPMG proper into a publicly traded company, which had its own history. I'll go down, but I've always had this kind of business analytical background. But I quickly figured out that my favorite use cases for that weren't stumpage rates and projections or logistics, simulation and optimization models, which all of which are cool, but just weren't necessarily as inspiring or as creatively intriguing as other things. So my first foray into communications research was when I actually found a really cool opportunity in South Africa for a company that was doing media analysis. And so they had all this data, they had a ton of analysts, and they had all these. It was just this crazy thing that I ran into through a network of people I was involved with through consulting. And they just had they worked for the government and they worked for all the biggest companies in South Africa. I was like, what is going on? So my first foray, this is back in the days when you literally had, every night VHS tapes being recorded of the nightly news the night before. You had paper copies of the newspaper being kind of shared around, marked up, and then put into access databases, right? So there's a fair bit of sophistication in terms of how to what data you should be looking for, and how to do it, and being able to do it multilinguistic, getting high intercoded reliability rates, all this kind of stuff. But it was a completely different reality from where we are today, right? The stuff was way more in depth and gave you a lot probably better guidance on tactics, but not very scalable, right?
Sure.
From there, I met the founder of the Reputation Institute, or Reputation Institute at the time, Charles Fonbrun. And so he brought me over to help kind of start up the business in the U.S. So I was in South Africa. I moved to Germany. The company was German headquartered. They moved me to New York. And in New York, I met Charles. And I was fascinated by everything they were doing with the RepTrak model, which now is the name of the company. And so a lot of my work there actually started with the intersection between media analysis and survey-based market research, right? So I've always been at that kind of there's from a purely analytical perspective, kind of from the get-go, if you will. I've always thought about a variety of different kind of research sources being your key input for kind of insights and activation, as well as setting and measuring KPIs. So I worked at Reputation Institute, which is now the RepTrak company, for just about a decade, and helped build what at the time was I think quite an impressive consulting business that spanned some really kind of high prestige companies, and not just high prestige, but companies that actually had the wherewithal and the senior leadership to actually put a lot of these models into action, which was the really impressive thing. So you could actually not just measure, but you could actually help guide. Where should we be investing in? What are the key issues? Who do we need to target and prioritize? And how will that enable us to grow? right? And then how do we use data and KPIs to actually help enable and accelerate the process? So if we believe these things to be true, if these are actual drivers, if we can unpack those into these very specific topics and issues, right? So how do we then set targets and then ensure that we're really moving the needle on an ongoing basis, right? Which is, as we all know, with something like reputation, it's a trying task, because you can say that the CEO is the chief reputation officer or reputation steward, but he or she are not guiding the day-to-day, right? So you're moving a tanker. So the people and companies I personally have seen as being most successful, those are people that can execute, but they can also kind of cajole, commandeer, and influence people to act.
Sure.
And I guess, so that's kind of how and so from there, as you said, I worked at a W2O group, very cool experience. At the time, the agency was 500. I think now it's probably double that. Out of the 500, 100 were in analytics. I worked across the analytics team and the corporate strategy team. And their kind of like the sole focus, it was like from a corporate affairs, corporate reputation, corporate strategy perspective, how to use social and digital to replicate or enhance what you could do with traditional market research.
Mm-hmm.
So, and now I'm at the Harris Poll, which every one of these iterations of the career have been like a different thing. The Harris Poll now is a really interesting and unique organization. It was its own independent, then it was part of Nielsen, now it's part of the Stagwell Group, which is a very heavy growth oriented organization that is very, very heavy in digital, right? While we're kind of this like traditional name that is kind of moving at that kind of pace and scale now. So it just, yeah, and like the co-CEOs running the business just bring a different level of kind of like energy and focus when you think of the focus of like the actual impact of the business. I think that's really manifested itself very clearly through much of what we've been doing around COVID-19, right? At mid-March, end of March. So there was a decision made that, we have no idea where this is going to go. But like we're the Harris Poll, it is our duty to help inform what is going on, right? So we're going to start putting research out there, and so one of the co-CEOs, John Gersma, has been kind of authoring a weekly newsletter that literally talks about all the trends of every day and every week, right? And so we've had our finger on the pulse, and all that data, just if anybody's not using it, it's all freely available, like the data, the tabs, everything, right? This is kind of our, to a large degree, the company, this is our mandate, right? This is like, people have no idea where to go. We need to be an information source. We have always been, we've done it for the last 50 years. It's more important for us to be doing it now than ever before. In addition to all the other stuff we're doing, which I think that refrain people have themselves felt in different ways. That's kind of our manifestation of like, here are your 2 new jobs or your 5 new jobs. Everybody's getting that. That's our incarnation of it. But it's, I think, everybody at the company is feeling very good about it. Like we're proud of the work, and we do think that it actually has a meaningful impact. As we'll talk about before, we just launched one of our big annual studies. We're doing it for 21 years, and one of the most typical refrains I've gotten from people just as I've been emailing back and forth this morning is, "Hey, and by the way, really appreciate all the research you guys have been putting out there. Has really helped us in terms of informing our strategy and helping us have better conversations internally with our leaders." Right. And that's one of the best compliments we can possibly get. So.
Sure. What an interesting journey you've been on, Rob. And indeed, I think many are intrigued by a lot of the interesting things going on at the Stagwell Group. It really seems to be an organization that's going about the sort of holding company journey in a little bit of a different and more thoughtful way. So I'll count myself among those that are interested to see what's next for the organization. So I think this question, yeah. So this question in particular, Rob, I think is interesting to ask you because of the journey that you just shared with us. Many would argue that the way in which communications research has been done over the years has been evolving and has evolved quite a bit, let's say over the past few decades. Some point to the kind of inclusion of additional channels, some point to the creation of new metrics, some point to simply the kind of, you could call it measurement governance, that has been advocated for by organizations like AMEC, like Barcelona Principles, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
But your perspective would be an interesting one to share with the audience about what has truly changed in terms of how reputation and other aspects of communications research is really done and how it's evolved over the years.
Sure. I mean, it's a big question, obviously, but it's a really important one. I mean, I certainly have a strong perspective on it, right? I think that when you start seeing the right KPIs that resonate with senior leaders, right, everything starts making more sense. Part of it is convincing people that the work you do is measurable, right, versus just being purely intangible. So leaders that have taken on that kind of mantra, right, I think have been a lot more successful than leaders who haven't taken on that mantra, right? So, I mean, I think that there's much of the communications discipline, which again, I think if you look at the last several decades of history, you're looking at some of the, the top practitioners are incredible, right? But not in all cases have you seen the top practitioners kind of leading with or being closely tied to data and insights, right? I mean, I think that's the big evolution. People have just taken on the mantle and they find the right, the biggest thing is there's no kind of like one research methodology or one idea that is kind of like the breakthrough concept, if you will, right? So, reputation is critically important. I think that for a lot of chief communications officers, it's still something that they hang their hat on as being, they are the reputation stewards. That is the big thing, which I completely agree with, right? But there's, like, what's the difference between brand and reputation? For some companies, having something called brand that might be closer to customers and customer consideration, that is actually the most important aspect, right? So for others, it's, the heart and core of everything we're doing is very focused on digital and media and social. And for that reason, we're actually going to focus more on those kinds of KPIs, those kinds of data streams to both kind of build our strategy and then to showcase our value. I'll say, I think one of the most meaningful things that's emerged is just the ability to be able to look at data and insights from the lens of the people who we're trying to bring onto our side and really whose expectations we want to meet. I think that historically that's been a little harder with media and so analysis. I think that's it's a lot better now than it ever has been in terms of really being able to put stakeholder lenses onto content. Putting channel lenses onto content is really important. I still believe there's no way to really get away. If you believe in kind of like a stakeholder centric model, whether it's around reputation or whatever other concept of relevance, we've done that helped build that at W2O, right? So whatever you want to call it, if you have stakeholders there, at some point you're going to actually need to talk to a stakeholder, somebody who for sure is that person, and ensure that they are representative of the population you are trying to engage, right? Which, for better or for worse, still pulls you back to some degree to traditional market research. I also don't think that survey-based research or interview-based research gives you all the answers. Like the big thing I would argue strongly is you really want to find the right tool for the right problem, right? Like there's a lot of problems that people should be solving on a daily basis, spending single thousands of dollars and probably pulling together multiple data streams, right? And then there's other problems that they're probably spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on more of an annual basis, right? You don't use your $1,000 solution for your CEO KPI, and you don't use your $100,000 or $1 million solution to help guide your daily interaction or your daily problem solving. You really need to be able to move between both those things and do it very efficiently so you don't get stalled, right? Mm-hmm. You want data to move and you need it to be as simple as possible, right? If I need data on a daily basis, it's got to be clean and simple and tell me exactly what to do, right? If I'm talking about an annual thing, it can be a little bit more obscure and it could be unpacked, it can be discussed, right? But you don't want to have the confusing data or the more ambiguous data on a minute by minute or day by day basis, right? And also conversely, you don't want to just have very tactical data that's getting put up to your CEO. You're not going to meet their expectations.
Sure. Interesting perspective, Rob. Let's talk a little bit about the elephant in the room, which is
Mhm.
COVID-19 and just the vast impact that it's having from an economic standpoint, from a really from a public health standpoint, and from a civil unrest standpoint. There's a lot going on in the world, and and you and your firm, the Harris Poll, have recently done some really interesting research around the impact that this is having on corporate reputation and other aspects of public opinion as well. So as we bring that actually a snippet of that research up, Rob, one of
Sure.
the things that I want to get your perspective on as it pertains to your clients is really the sentiment that you're getting from clients. I mean, is this um, a period of time where investment into communications research, into public opinion research is increasing because companies are so concerned about their next chapter, what's ahead for their customers, what's ahead for their employees, what's ahead for their suppliers? Or is this a period of time that is, where your clients are just kind of pressing pause on everything, waiting to see what happens, over the next several months and quarters as the world hopefully returns to normal?
I mean, I think you're seeing a very big difference between some of the companies that are on the top of this list versus others. And that some of that is company culture, some of that is just the industry I'm in and the expectation that's there. So I think you're seeing a variety of different things. What I will say in general, like the key thing to take away, this is the top 10 of our annual Axios Harris 100 list. Historically, it's been called the RQ study. This is its 21st year, so it's got some gusto to it. But the main takeaway here is the companies that are really winning on reputation are also the ones that are just delivering day-to-day value, right? It's basically right now the headspace that the public is in and really most stakeholders are in. And I would say even most companies that we're working with are in, it's about kind of utility and action and value, right? How are you delivering those things versus vision and aspiration? To kind of one of the things you're alluding to, I think right now there's a bit of a gap that's emerging. Like everyone is just so head down on this week, this day, where you need to find some time to be able to project forward. It's just hard to do because everyone's just grinding right now. At the same time, I mean, I just think like the whole ethos, this is like, we're now 3 or 4 studies into, this is the RQ, this is re-benchmark 21 years. It's very clear as to the shift in companies, the Clorox company, my gosh, right? Like hasn't really, so in order to become part of this study, you have to be top of mind. Like you actually have to qualify, you have to be highly noteworthy in the minds of the public, and then you get scored, right? So Clorox was not on anyone's radar. Now they are very firmly, right? No surprise, but again, high utility, direct solution to not all problems, but to a lot of very specific problems, right? So, and again, it's been this trend. We just, in the middle of COVID, we created this new framework, which ended up, it was a study called the Essential 100. You saw the same kind of thing happening here. You're seeing a big drive. This is not gonna be a surprise, we've been doing industry research for 18, 19 years, right? Right now, for example, for the pharmaceutical and health insurance industries, it's a 2-3 times pinnacle versus anything we've ever seen, right? You're probably not back to 30 years ago heyday where you had Merck and Pfizer at the top and on the covers of Fortune Most Admired, but you're now starting to see, especially what we're seeing right now, it's Pfizer right now top of mind, right? So Pfizer's on part of the, this most noteworthy 100, the Axios Harris 100 for the first time since 2011, right? So it's, again, like there's a lot of industries that are coming to bear. I've done a lot of interviews on healthcare and pharma, so I can talk a lot about that. But I mean, I'll just say there's some of those, and it's an industry I've really believed in. I've worked in for the last 20 years. It's like such high value, but really gets stuck in the issues versus the benefits. It's very difficult. It's very expensive. It's very time consuming. It's really hard to understand. But right now, you're actually seeing a lot of resonance around the industry and the real kind of value it creates, right? So you're seeing this reputation spike, but really it's people are just looking at those kind of companies through a very different lens, right? It's not through a lens of kind of pricing and access. It's through a lens of, holy crap, if these companies move, hustle, rejigger with help from policymakers, they can actually move really quickly. If they actually work together, they can actually get to some really interesting results. And all this stuff is very kind of measurable, very tangible. So there's, you know, a lot of shifts, but it's, again, it's value and utility, baby. Right now, that's where it is. So
Sure. Thanks for your perspective, Rob.
yeah.
I highly recommend that you know, our audience checks the long form version of the report out. Some really interesting insights for the business community at large, but also for communications research practitioners as well. And to that point, Rob, you know, there's a question that we've been getting from our audience a lot, and I'll frame that question to you because of your work at the Harris Poll in particular. If you're a communications researcher that works at, you know, one of the big industries that's front and center during the COVID-19 crisis, you mentioned, you know, pharma, maybe biotech, but even some of the other companies that are providing
retail, CVS, Walmart, Kroger.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, you know, companies that are providing essential services, you know, if they're concerned about being able to measure with precision some of the short-term fluctuations in reputation, how do communications researchers go about this? Because it's kind of an unusual situation right now. The news cycle is dominated by COVID-19. You know, we've been talking to at the Institute for Public Relations many brands that you know, are looking at their share of voice in their respective industry decline sharply, in addition to the same happening for all of their peers, et cetera. So a lot of communications researchers are just kind of throwing their hands up and saying, well, the usual mechanisms of measuring reputation and relevance, et cetera, if you use those, it certainly doesn't look good. So what would your advice be to a communications research practitioner that's trying to navigate these kind of strange times at one of these front and center brands?
Yeah, I mean, I'll follow through with the same kind of psyche we're seeing kind of pull through, right? It is a different framework right now. So again, all the research, the industry research does this really nicely. Most industries are up pretty dramatically since from January to now. We fielded our RRQ study in January, February. We didn't release it for pretty obvious reasons. Like, I mean, not very timely, not very relevant at all. But we had the data. We've actually been refielding the data on a monthly basis. The big takeaway is that companies are generally seen as part of the solution. Macro, we even ask those questions. You get like, it's like an 80-20 in terms of, you know, the public seeing companies as part of the solution. Versus if you go back to the financial crisis, which was the last big crisis, companies across the board, especially financial service companies, were seen as part of the problem, right? So if we already have that hat on and we're thinking about utility and value, every company, every industry, like, this is my suggestion, you really want to be using your analysis as an intelligence tool to drive better engagement, right? You should be identifying actual problems you can solve, right? Problems that are apparent in the communications data that you are collecting, whether it's perception data, media data, social data, right? Like, put on the lens of it being, you know, it's better to be a PSA than kind of a brand strategist right now, right? So like, focus on public service and, you know, and just solving problems. And there's many of those problems that are going to be like either directly or tangentially associated with your business. I mean, and we didn't even talk about this, right? The whole, like, everything that's emerged right now around, for example, racial disparity, right? It's very much an inequality story, right? You know, in all the research we're doing, there's very few Americans who would say that inequality isn't a big problem. There's a large difference in terms of the magnitude of the problem right now versus 10 years out and how to address it and all these kind of things. But there's nobody who would say, oh yeah, there's no inequality issue. Virtually zero people, right? Or very few people. So, you know, that, as again, having that hat on, you should be looking for, if they're, you know, this is true and this is being exacerbated right now, who are the people who are actually most at risk? Who are the ones that are being most affected that you can actually help in some sort of way, right? That's kind of like, and you can find a lot of those people, those personas, those profiles, and, you know, invert a lot of your research to actually be focused on, how do I help create a solution? How do I help identify these people, not so I can target them to buy a new pair of jeans, but in order to actually get them some information they need, you ideally I'm getting some credit for it as a company, as a brand as well, right? No issue there. Just make sure that it's heavy on kind of utility and value. For many companies, there's also an opportunity to kind of communicate a little bit more broadly than just very specific to COVID. But at some point, you're going to have to kind of at least connect it to the reality that COVID has created for them and their families, right? It doesn't need, but there's, as we've all seen, there's all sorts of negative, particularly like side effects of COVID, just in terms of, how people are living, right? How like the stress levels are, again, in all our research, we do a lot of work with the American Psychological Association, are higher than ever, right? Like I'm not telling some people something they don't know, right? Everybody's literally living this. You're like, it's Groundhog Day again. And, I've been homeschooling my kids, or, I have to deal with all sorts of, really difficult family situations, right? Which, that is what it is, right? And everything's exacerbated. Like you can't get around it. So
Right.
Full circle back, like focus on utility, right? That's how you're going to make an impact. You can break through 100% if you are creating value for people, right? Maybe you may not be society at large, but you can find the people who you are relevant to and create value for them, right? That's how we should be thinking about research. And in general, I hope that's like a trend that actually continues when you come even out of COVID time, right? We are business strategists. We are business intelligence people, right? We are not just kind of communications engineers, if you will, right? It happens that a lot of us are very good communications engineers, and that's something that's really important for companies, right? But that shouldn't be our kind of like sole purpose, right? It's not about wordsmithing and kind of just polishing that edge on the brand identity and that kind of thing, right? Those are all important aspects. There's tactical things we need to get done there, and in many cases we get a lot of kudos for those things, but we have to be thinking like business strategists, like business intelligence people.
Absolutely, Rob, and that's a big shift that we've seen in the communications and public relations community. This focus on using the language of business and conveying points about engagement, whether it's engagement with internal stakeholders or external stakeholders, in a way that resonates with the C-suite. So there's no doubt that that's been a major shift in the way that the communications and public relations function carries out its responsibilities. It's changed quite a bit over the past several years. Mm-hmm. Rob, so as we wrap up this conversation, one question that I'm really interested and keen to get your perspective on is the future. You've seen measurement and evaluation from more broadly a market research standpoint, but also specifically relating to communications research, evolved so much over the years. Again, before I was mentioning the inclusion of new data sources, new KPIs, different ways, more resonant ways to visualize this information, et cetera. A lot has changed in measurement and evaluation over the years. But what are you most excited about moving forward, Rob? What's ahead for the communications research or the market research profession that we all can look forward to moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that are happening from a broader macro trend perspective that in some cases are super intuitive to communicators, but maybe not as kind of resonant as they should be, right? Like, so if we're going back, you could be going back as, I'm not going to make it political, but I'm just joking. If you look at the inauguration of maybe our last president, there have been a number of trends, right, that have just manifested around them that are really important to note. They have to do with a lot of how people are thinking about the social impact of companies. They have to do with how, different generations are thinking about things like, CSR, the environment, things like this, right? So there's a reason why pre-COVID you had 181 CEOs sign on to the Business Roundtable statement, right? Many of them are very altruistic people, so that's great. But many of them also are highly pragmatic and are realizing that they're really big brands that just had tanker momentum, were not getting the customers and talent that they wanted, right? So when you look at kind of a lot of the demographic shifts, changes in persona and expectations, that's how you get that many people to sign on to something that says we're not just about shareholders, because by us saying that and acting that way, we actually become irrelevant to a lot of people, especially younger generations of people, right? So again, that's like a 3 to 5 year trend. That's like a point. As you look at COVID, all that stuff just gets accelerated, right? Because you're actually seeing companies create value, right, for society, for people, and based off of that same kind of perspective, right? I'm not going to just do business as usual. I'm going to change the way I do business because society needs it, right? So again, that's the big macro trend. You can think of those things like CSR or sustainability in the environment as being more kind of like background things in the past that are now much more foreground things. They are going to be critical components of strategy. In many cases, communications groups have a unique perspective, not just on those, but how those things intersect with other stuff, right? So I would argue, I would hope that most comms groups and their measurement groups actually have much better frameworks for looking at a lot of those issues than many other parts of the organization, because many other parts of the organization have never even thought of doing it, right? It's not part of my customer acquisition funnel, whatever, right? It's not part of my risk profiling, right? I was thinking of financial risk and how I can mitigate that using insurance policies that hedge, right? They weren't thinking about a lot of these ingredients. So we have the data. A lot of these things are very much on trend, but they are not a standalone item, right? They're now part of the business strategy. So we just got to think about that as another building block, right? But so when you look at the future, that stuff's going to continue, and it's going to manifest itself in new and different ways. The communications discipline and the measurement discipline needs to be on the front end of that, right? It's got to be very pragmatic in terms of identifying, not just thematically, here's some stuff we should focus on. It's, well, no, it's actually, if that is true, this is how these are the new kinds of initiatives that we need to be thinking about. Here's what we can learn from other industries and that they're actually breaking through on this stuff and we're not. Here are the kinds of organizations we need to build relationships with. Here are the kind of certifications we need to get. Here's the kind of places we need to be involved, right? Here's how we enhance our, how our CEO is taking many things that he or she is personally passionate about, but may have been more in the background. How do we bring that more into the foreground, right? And honestly, one of the things I think is really interesting is as you bring more of these ingredients in, like what it really leads you to is how do you make organizations and business leaders just look more human, right? How do you make them look less like business people using business jargon, right? When you have a lot of these other elements, it actually just creates a more compelling profile, right? Net, and that's how we should think about it, right? Like think of a person, like it's, we want our brand, we want our company, we want our CEO and top executives to be relatable, right? Especially in these times of extreme inequality. The more unrelatable you seem, the more out of touch you look directly.
Thanks so much for your perspective, Rob. That's great, I think, advice for communications research practitioners that are thinking about how to help their organizations navigate these challenging times. So thanks for your perspective, Rob. As our audience knows, the Institute for Public Relations mission is really to illuminate the science beneath the art of public relations and strategic communications. And this video series is really focused on trying to highlight perspectives that advance the profession by hopefully democratizing, the information around different journeys that folks have had, some pragmatic advice they have on how to go about communications research from a methodology standpoint, or even how to more effectively convey a lot of these insights to the C-suite. So if you have any comments, questions about this conversation or the ongoing series, please feel free to share those in the comments. We're doing this, but on a bi-weekly basis, so we'll be back to you soon. Thanks so much for your perspective, Rob. Appreciate you being on.
Thank you for having me, Mo. Really appreciate it.
Thanks again, Rob.
Cheers.
Cheers.